Hey everybody, I'm Chris Snellgrove, and you're listening to the House of Grey. In the blue corner, Damien the Diamond Peterson. In the red corner, Cyan the drop-dead, gorgeous, mysterious, unbelievable fencing master Harrison. Wow, so the Diamond and Cyan are really gonna throw down, huh? If you haven't listened in a while, here's what's been happening. Monson has found himself a few weeks into the school year, becoming better and better friends with Casey and Artorius, more and more wary of Derek, and discovering that his talent for fencing is less than stellar. Last episode ended with an announcement that Cyan and Damien were about to fight. Who will be crowned the victor? Keep it locked in right here to find out as we jump into episode 12. I think the whole school is here. Monson looked around as he, Casey, and Artorius followed Ignace. Most, if not all of the student body, rushed down the hall, away from the secondary gyms, and converged on the main pathway leading to the battlefield's main doors. The mob of students rushed through the double set of massive doors to the broad expanse of the main field. They hurried down dozens of stairs until they finally reached the guardrail separating the field from the spectators. As excited as he was, Monson could not help but again marvel at the main field chamber. The battlefield was not like most football stadiums. True, it had all those indispensable items that a massive football stadium should have. The things that people expected, like tiered seating, press boxes, lighted scoreboards, concession stands, VIP boxes near the field with private entrances for the rich and famous, and many other things one would expect to see. In these details, it was like any other shamefully expensive sports stadium. There was, however, one defining characteristic that skyrocketed the battlegrounds above, or below in this case, all other sports complexes. This stadium was completely underground. When someone entered the battlegrounds, they suddenly found themselves at the very top of the tiered seating, with the seats flowing downward in the traditional fashion. With the entrances of the dome structure being at ground level, this meant whoever built the complex had to dig one massive hole. Why the architect decided to design the field like this, Monson did not know. It seemed outrageous. In truth, he could not think of something less practical. Moving the dirt alone probably cost a fortune. Despite all this, the home field of the Corn University Legionnaires did have a certain beauty. He looked around at the mass of the oncoming students when a thought occurred to him. He looked at Casey. "Hey, how does everyone know about this fight? It seems unlikely that this is just word of mouth." Casey shrugged, and at the very same time, Ignace flipped open her phone, answering the question. The text message read, "Attention all, battlegrounds, Cyan and the Diamond, it's go time." Well, that explained it. Students continued to file down the long descending stairway and flowed over the field like cattle. The head of the pack stopped short as they all reached the center of the field. Monson smiled in anticipation. This must be where everything was going to go down. In the distance, he saw a group of upperclassmen. This new crowd of students stood in two distinct groups in the very middle of the field, right on the 50-yard line. They gathered on opposite ends of a large red wrestling mat that someone had moved there. Where the mat came from and why it was there, who knew? But it was there, and so people headed for it. Though the mob of people made it difficult, Monson, Casey, and Artorius caught a glimpse of Indigo, talking excitedly with some of her friends on one side of the mat. On the other side, a corny banner with the words "Damien the Diamond Peterson" splashed across it, waved through the air, held aloft by two older-looking boys. The trio could also see the Diamond himself from this angle, although his back was to them, making it impossible to see his face. He was chatting with a group of 4 or 5 people, none of which Monson readily recognized. The 3 boys stood there for a moment more, surveying the scene until Casey gestured towards Indigo. They rushed towards her. She turned when she noticed them. "Hey boys, where's the fire?" She was smiling excitedly, her tone a bit on the sardonic side. She was also beaming around at the assembling crowd. It was plainly obvious that she was enjoying the attention, even if it was not totally focused on her. "Just coming to catch the show." Casey looked at Monson and Artorius, who both nodded in agreement. "Damian Peterson challenging your sister to a fight? No way we're gonna miss this. That's the stuff of legends." Indigo nodded in agreement. "I doubt there's a single student in class. The teachers are gonna be pissed." Monson was not really paying attention to the conversation. He glanced at Cyan, who was checking the armor she used for official kendo matches. This random observation struck a chord within him. Come to think of it, he had never actually seen Cyan fight in an official match of any type. Non-official, yes, she fought those all the time, but in official ones, like with a referee and actual points? No, he was pretty sure he had not seen it. What a startling revelation. There was chattering in the background, most likely from Casey and Indigo. Despite the buzzing around him, Monson could not take his eyes off Cyan. Currently, she was a ways off, leaning casually on one knee. Her back was to them, and he suspected she was checking her armor for any kinks or problems. Without even realizing it, he found himself moving towards her. Why was he approaching her? To talk to her? What was he going to say? "You certainly know how to draw a crowd." Cyan froze, probably trying to figure out who was speaking to her over the din of the crowd. Her body seemed to ripple, as if a sudden and overwhelming chill enveloped her. She ran a hand through her hair. "We've been over this, Mr. Grey." She did not sound surprised. "I don't draw crowds. I'm a mere victim of circumstance." She did not look up from her armor as she ran her hands across the leather straps that held the breastplate in place. Monson stood in silence for a moment, then shifting to her side, he plopped down next to her. She looked up from the heavy armor, a guarded expression on her face. Monson gave her a quizzical look. She always looked upset, but that was not what was bothering him. Well, actually that did bother him, but she was always like that. No, what was really bothering him was, "How did you know it was me?" Without missing a beat or showing any trace of a smile, she answered, "The smell. You're very pungent." "What the?" Monson thought. What is she talking about? Wait, he could not believe it. She was joking. "Cyan!" Monson looked at her amazed. "You made a joke." He turned around as if he were searching frantically. "Hang on, I need to write this down. Take a picture, something. This is momentous." Her eyes scrunched again, though this time he could not tell if she was upset or trying not to laugh. "Come on, Cyan, laugh," said the voice in Monson's head. She did not laugh. Her guarded expression ebbed back. She sounded upset. "I do know how to joke, Monson Grey." "Well, that's obvious. I never even see you smile, let alone laugh. I mean, I'm sure you're capable, but I've never actually seen you do it." He sighed. "Such a pretty girl, too. I'm sure you have a beautiful smile. What a waste." This time, Monson froze. What in the world just came out of his mouth? Did he really just say what he thought he said? Slowly, he brought his gaze up to hers. Their eyes connected. She did not look upset. She looked confused. She turned from him and stood, scooping up her helmet and the rest of her armor. She walked away, an unsure step disharmonizing the gait of her normally smooth stride. "Wonderful. Just call me Mr. Smooth," he thought. He dredged his way back towards Casey, Artorius, and the others. He sat down between his two friends who were not paying the slightest bit of attention. He silently mused. Really, he should start carrying a roll of duct tape for occasions when he felt like talking, especially to the opposite sex. After another 15 minutes or so, he noticed others starting to become restless. Nothing was happening. Only the annoying chatter of unusually high-strung students echoed around the gathering. A pang of unfamiliar emotion coursed through Monson. It startled him. "No, not now," screamed the voice in his head. He looked at Artorius and Casey, who were still off in their respective worlds. "It's that feeling again, the dangerous one." He stopped. No, this was different. It was not that feeling. It was something else. It was worry? He felt worried. But why? What reason was there to worry? He looked around for Cyan, and then Damien. He found himself with the same set of people as before. It hit him. He was worried about Cyan. Damien Peterson, the diamond. He was a lot bigger than Cyan. Cyan flattened Casey, but how was she going to handle someone who had 100 pounds and 7 inches on her? True, she had technique and power, but could she defeat someone like Damien? He gave his emotions a mental shake. He was being stupid. This girl remained undefeated. Undefeated, as in never lost a single match. Instead of worrying about the girl who can obviously take care of herself, maybe he should just pray that he never has to fight her. Yeah, he thought, that would be a much better use of my time. Monson turned his attention back to Cyan. Her armor in place, she was now strolling slowly towards the middle of the mat. Her pace looked confident, bearing no marks of the uneasiness that weighed her down moments ago. She walked with her short balkan at her side, bringing its weight up to rest on a shoulder only when she came to a halt. She waited. Tumultuous applause caught many off guard, as sound erupted with all the warning of a night raid siren. Finally visible, Damien Peterson walked towards Cyan, emerging from a large group of friends on his side of the mat. His clothing felt totally random, borderline humorous. Instead of the kendo armor that Cyan was so fond of, he wore a tight-fitting, long-sleeved shirt and matching leggings that many of the boys used for football practice. What was that called again? Monson thought. Under Armour, yeah, that's it. It looked funny on him, as he was wearing more than one layer of the thin clothing, causing it to bunch and rumple all over his body. His weapon of choice was a wooden shaft cut expertly in the shape of an English longsword. It looked very complete with its oversized pommel and cross-shaped hilt. True enough, if not for the wooden blade, the weapon in Damien's hand was a sword in almost every sense of the word. Monson had to wonder if the choice was deliberate. Were they about to see a different sword-fighting style? An interesting question he hoped to have answered. Damien continued until he was about 5 feet from Cyan. He turned back and put up a hand to quiet the crowd. They went silent immediately. Satisfied, he faced toward Cyan. "Are you ready for our match?" His voice was quiet but carried across the crowd nonetheless. Cyan's response was as calm as ever, but sounded resigned. "I am, but didn't I tell you to go train first? Why are you back so soon?" "I have been training." Damien sounded prideful. "I found an excellent teacher and practiced just like you said, and it's about time I put that first tick mark in your losses column." He was not boasting, for people like Damien Peterson did not need to boast. He was merely stating a fact. Cyan shook her head. "Okay, Mr. Diamond, let's see the fruits of this training." Cyan proceeded into her routine of bowing, offering, and twisting her weapon. The movements reminded Monson of Cyan and Casey's fight. Back then, those opening movements felt odd, out of place even. They did not feel any different now. He wondered what their purpose was. Damien's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Same rules as last time?" He sounded hopeful. Cyan nodded. He beamed. Monson leaned to Casey, who was sitting next to him. "Wait, what rules? I didn't know Cyan played with rules." Casey looked at Monson incredulously. "What rules? Grey, have you been living under a box for the past 2 months?" Monson scowled at Casey. "Not unless you've been living in the box with me, because there's hardly a day that I'm not with you and Arthur." "Don't call me Arthur." Monson rolled his eyes. "Sorry, Artorius." Casey answered in stride, as if the interruption had not happened. "True enough. Okay, I guess I should explain." Monson tilted towards him. Casey gathered his thoughts. "Well, you're well aware that Cyan does not like to be confined by the normal fencing rules." Monson nodded. This was a well-known fact. Everyone knew this. "I found out she started her own little fencing club a while ago. A club with only one rule. There are no rules. Dude, when Cyan says there are no rules, she means it." Casey pointed towards Damien. "Do you see how he's barely wearing any protective gear?" Monson again simply nodded. Casey smiled. "Good. I'm glad you noticed. Now, let me ask you this. Why would I do that? But before you answer, remember that Cyan's hits have all the impact of a bullet train. Just remember what she did to me, bro." Monson thought for a moment, but the answer seemed obvious. "Well, obviously he feels he can gain some sort of advantage from less protective gear. Maybe his speed will increase?" Monson looked at Casey expectantly. Artorius cut in. "That may be part of it, but think of something more direct, more brutal." It hit Monson. His hands. He's planning to fight with his hands and not just his weapon. "Bingo." "Bingo." Casey finished up. "And that's not all, bro. According to Cyan's rules, you can strike with hand, foot, or weapon. It doesn't matter. You lose if you're disarmed and taken down, knocked out, or your opponent taps out." Monson was at a loss for words. Why would she go to such lengths? Just for a good match? He did not understand. Their conversation remained unfinished. Before the three of them could plunge deeper into the topic, movement from Cyan and Damien stopped them. The two combatants were starting to move in on each other. The boys' attention shifted quickly towards the battling duo. It was actually very surprising. Damien was displaying some good footwork, skirting the edge of his weapon's reach and testing Cyan by sweeping at her with very basic slashes at her midsection. Cyan dodged or deflected these attempts easily, as there was barely any force behind them. Damien switched tactics. He volleyed a half a dozen attacks, each stronger than the last, augmenting his sword strikes with blows from both his hands and feet. Casey looked over at Monson smugly, with a "what did I tell you" sort of look. Damien paid the price, however, as every weaponless strike was struck down by Cyan's sword. Seeing that the alternating sword-hand technique was not working, he switched back to his previous strategy of furious sword strikes. On the last swing of the second of these barrages, something changed in the flow of the match. On this particular blow, Cyan deflected and took a step towards Damien, using a signature move, the flash forward. The flash forward was nothing more than speedy footwork. Its name came from the fact that the speed one used in the move seemed slightly superhuman. For a few microseconds, it was almost as if Cyan disappeared from view, then reappeared feet ahead of her starting point. Damien reposed, bringing his long sword down sharply before she could take more than a step, effectively cutting off the flash forward and creating a small opening in Cyan's flawless defenses. He could not take advantage of the opening, however, as Cyan retreated and reposed almost as quick as she moved forward. "Impressive. He actually anticipated the flash forward." Artorius and Monson were too entranced to answer. Damien postured himself, matching Cyan in an on-guard stance. They eyed each other for a moment more. Then, moving forward, Damien again attacked, this time with light, cleaving slashes. On the second volley of his strokes, it appeared as if Damien overextended his attack, creating a small opening in his defense. To their shocked amazement, Cyan did not capitalize on the opening. "Dude, that was stupid." Casey had apparently noticed Cyan's lost opportunity. "Not in the least." Monson squinted towards the combatants, then towards Casey. "Did you miss it?" Casey looked at Monson, confusion evident on his face. Monson heard Artorius laugh on his other side. Monson glared back at Casey. Was he joking? Playing dumb just to get a rise out of him? No, that was not it. He really did not know. Even if Casey missed it, Monson knew he was right. It was like something suddenly clicked into place. Speaking with confidence, Monson continued. He was fainting, Casey. Damien was just trying to goad her into ending it early. He leaned back on his elbows so that he could see both of his friends. Casey and Artorius scrutinized him. He stared back.
Grey?
Artorius looked particularly perplexed at his words.
That's amazing. I was just thinking the exact same thing.
Casey stared at the two of them, confused.
I don't get it. How do you know he was fainting? It didn't look like he was fainting to me.
Monson pointed towards Cyan.
Cyan's a very technical fighter. She's totally clean in her defense, and while her offense isn't as strong, it's very hard to fight her in a one-on-one setting. Her greatest weapon is her patience and the fact that she doesn't make any mistakes. That's what she used against you, Casey.
He glanced at the battle, in particular at Cyan, then turned his attention back to Casey, who just gawked at him.
Offensively, you are much stronger than Cyan. If you faced a score of weaker, less technical opponents, you would probably have a much better chance at winning. Your style is designed to take people out quickly, thus lessening the chance of extended combat. Cyan, on the other hand, has a style that allows for extended combat with a single individual. That's exactly what happened to you. You got angry and impatient.
He stopped talking. He tried to think back to that epic first encounter with Cyan Harrison, Casey and his powerful full-body blows that twisted and grinded against the grain of physical strength and mental endurance, his overhead strikes and furious slashes that rained down with precision, all aimed at the head, legs, and chest, each becoming increasingly violent and brutal. Monson could remember the tough offense, the attacks that left nothing but the blow itself, attacks that became overextended.
Monson started back up. You overextended your attack, Casey. In doing so, you couldn't recover on the counter-strike. She took advantage of that by attacking the blow instead of the body.
Silence greeted the end of his sudden discourse. Casey and Artorius just looked at him, then at each other. Monson felt suddenly embarrassed.
Grey, I take it all back.
Casey's voice was low and thoughtful, like he was in awe.
Take what back, Case? I take it back, man. What I said about me being the main character of your life story?
Monson tried to think back to what he was talking about. He suddenly remembered. That whole movie thing.
Yeah, what about it? I take it all back, bro. As it seems you're much more interesting than I originally thought. Thanks, Casey. I think.
Grey?
Artorius' voice sounded serious.
I think we're fast approaching that time when you tell us who you are and how you know so much about things you say you know nothing about.
Taken aback, Monson looked downward.
I'll tell you what I remember.
His voice was barely a whisper.
But not yet, okay? Please, not yet.
Monson could tell without looking that Casey and Artorius were communicating silently.
All right, bro. When you're ready, we'll be here.
Their attention focused back on the match, which was really heating up. Damien was good. Really good, actually. His form seemed balanced, alternating between aggressive blows and well-executed defensive maneuvers. His style did not seem as form-heavy as Cyan's or even the John No. It was quite obvious that whatever the style Damien Peterson learned, it was very different. His style relied on strength, which was an advantage in this situation. This was not the impressive part, however. What was truly impressive was his patience. It appeared as if he were trying to wear Cyan down, forcing her to defend heavy, overhead and cross-body strikes. Most of these, Cyan was able to avoid completely, but it was apparent that the ones that found her sword were taking their toll. The repetitive concussive force was having a visible effect. It was jarring her out of her position and making her reaction time dull slightly. This was not surprising, as she was, after all, a great deal smaller than Damien. Being so close, Monson and the others could hear pieces of the fighters' running conversation.
"You've improved a great deal, Damien."
She blocked alternating blows aimed at her head and limbs.
"I told you I would."
His voice sounded proud. He reposed as he spoke, centering himself. It was obvious that the constant onslaught was taking a toll on him as well.
"You'd better not back out once I beat you."
Cyan countered a move that looked very similar to the two-step. It was not quite the two-step. The footwork seemed off, and Damien was overextending his thrusts a bit, but it was very close. She deflected both thrusts of the modified two-step, using the same downward-pointing cross-body block that Casey and Artorius used on Monson earlier. After blocking the last thrust, she did not repose, but rather swept her blade up in a clockwise motion, knocking his blade away from his body. Everyone saw it. Damien was open, and for real this time. Cyan arced her small blade towards his head. She barely missed as he dropped back, panting. Cyan's voice came like a calming breeze.
"If you beat me, Damien. If."
Casey turned to Monson and Artorius.
"Dude, did you guys catch that?"
"Yeah, Cyan almost took the diamond's head off."
"No, dude. Not what she did. What he said." "Yeah, I heard."
Monson looked solemnly at Casey.
"Back out of what? I don't understand. What are they talking about?"
Casey answered, a malicious grin beginning to creep across his face.
"Bro, he wants to go out with her."
Monson's jaw dropped.
"You're kidding."
"No way."
Casey laughed.
"No, seriously. Think about it. Why else would he be fighting her?"
Casey made a very good point. There was no other reason to fight Cyan, unless you were trying to hook up with her. It was true. It had to be. Damien Peterson was jonesing for Cyan Harrison. There was a moan from the crowd, then silence. The three boys swung their attention back towards the fray, just in time to see the mock longsword of the diamond soaring overhead and the tip of Cyan's blade come to rest on his throat. The two opponents stared at each other. Damien gave her a look of sordid emotion, like a mix of awe and admiration.
"Well played, Cyan. You too, Damien."
His gaze bored into her and seemed to intensify by the moment.
"If I beat you."
His words trailed off.
"Yeah, if you beat me."
She removed her blade from his throat. Damien looked like he wanted to say something, but was unable to as she turned from him. Indigo called her name, beckoning her forward to a waiting group of girls. She started to move towards her sister. Damien watched her go, following her every step as she walked slowly away from him. These actions surprised Monson, as something about it screamed of familiarity. He paused in an attempt to center his thoughts. He realized something. This has happened before. This was not the first match between Cyan and Damien. Cyan's gaze fell upon Monson. He lifted his eyes to meet her.
The timing. It was spooky, as if she was reading his mind or maybe his mood.
He shifted as he looked at her, and she at him. It was making him very uncomfortable.
"What's going through your head, Cyan?" he said to himself. "What is it you're thinking? Nerves? Confusion? The color gray. Very gray. Belief? Pain. So much pain."
Casey's voice jarred Monson from his reverie.
"Dude, is there anything that kid can't do?"
His voice boomed as if it was coming from a megaphone.
"I mean, football, basketball, baseball, and now street fencing?"
Cyan and Monson's gaze broke as he looked towards Casey.
Sorry, what was that, Case?"
His eyes darted back to Cyan to get a sneaky double take.
"I wasn't exactly paying attention."
Artorius spoke up.
It does seem rather amazing.
He looked quizzically at Monson and Casey.
But there's no way that was just natural talent. Someone taught him, just like Cyan. Someone gave him lessons. Someone with a ton of talent themselves.
Hold up, fellas.
Monson interjected before either could make any additional comments.
What are you guys talking about? Dude, Damian Peterson's fencing ability.
And who taught him?
Oddly enough, it was Damian who answered their question. He was again standing amongst his groupies on his side of the mat, speaking to the very last person the three boys expected to see.
I'm sorry. I did exactly as you showed me, but it appears that Cyan may have been holding back last time.
Monson, Artorius, and Casey looked on in disbelief, all of them thinking the same thing.
Nice to see everyone back for another episode of Collin Earl's The House of Grey. Can anyone best Cyan? I mean, when the diamond goes up against her and basically gets his pride handed to him on a silver platter. Ouch, that's gotta hurt. And what's up with Mr. Gat? When did he go medieval and gain mad fencing skills? Strange things are definitely afoot at Collin University. In this episode, Monson discovers that his life goes from somewhat out of the ordinary to downright unexplainable. Despite the oddities of his friends, the inexplicable attention he constantly receives from Taurus, and the incomprehensible events he's studying in Mr. Gat's class, nothing thus far has prepared him for, well, I can't go and give away the episode before you listen to it, now can I? Make sure your seats and tray tables are in the upright and locked position, and the reality center of your brain is currently switched off, 'cause here we go with lucky number 13.
You've got to be kidding me. Mr. Gat taught Damian?
The voice of Taurus Green exploded across the table. Monson and his friends nodded. She sat back, a look of total astonishment assaulting her features. It was dinner time, mere hours after the match between Cyan and Damian. An odd assortment of students was sitting at a table in an obscure corner of the GM's massive cafeteria. Furtive glances by upperclassmen abased them frequently, as Taurus Green, Indigo Harrison, and many of the upcoming freshman hotties sat chatting seriously with Monson, Casey, and Artorius. Monson looked around at the peculiar collection of girls. Most of them were desperately trying to avoid his eye.
How did this happen?
He thought. Dinner that evening began normal enough. Monson, Artorius, and Casey were discussing the match when Indigo and her friends overheard. Indigo switched tables right away, while the others, including Agnes Ikeko, looked reluctant to do so. Taurus made her appearance shortly thereafter. The fact that she was in the main cafeteria at all was odd. Even more out of context, she was actually eating with him and his friends. He used the word eating lightly as she was not actively consuming anything. Through the subsequent hurried conversation, he discovered that she and many of her upperclassmen friends were not actually present at the match, being some of the few who either did not receive the viral text message or just could not come. Whether this was the reason for Taurus's sudden excursion to the dining hall, he did not know and did not feel like asking her. The outcome of the big match produced many questions. The first and most intriguing had to be Mr. Gat. How does a history teacher understand the mechanics of medieval fencing techniques? Movie stuntmen learned that stuff, not high school students. Further, how would Damian know that Mr. Gat had this skill when it came as such a surprise to everyone else? And why go through all the trouble? Actually, they all knew the answer to this last question. Cyan. After all, she was absolutely gorgeous, with her black hair and icy blue eyes. It was much more than just her outward appearance, however. She expressed an inner power, an unflinching, unassuming strength that boasted absolute control. Absolute confidence.
Absolute confidence,
thought Monson.
He thought back to their conversation, back on the mat right before the match. He recalled the unsettled glide of her walk, an unsure step, a wavering thought, discordance, a lot of discordance. Currently, Cyan sat 2 tables away, eating alone with earphones on and her face in a book. Monson studied her for a moment as she softly swayed to the music of her iPod. He looked at the cover of the book she was reading, Lagon Awakening or something like that. He could not quite make out the artwork splashed across the cover. An impression popped in his mind as he stared at her. Impressions always seemed to surface when she was involved. This impression told him that maybe she was not as captivated by the book as she initially appeared. Who knew if this was actually true? He was always having weird feelings around her. Artorius continued telling Indigo and her friends about the discovery of Damien's instructor, while Monson continued to watch Cyan. There was a huffy silence to his left, but he looked on, despite Taurus's passive-aggressive objections. Unexpectedly, Cyan glanced his way, catching him staring at her. A confused expression, the same one he witnessed right before her match, stretched across her face. A loud voice rang out from his left. Hello, Grey." He shifted towards the voice. Indigo and her friends were staring at him. He scanned their faces. Did he miss something?
Did you need something, Indigo?"
She laughed.
"Well, duh. I asked you a question like 10 minutes ago. Are you that entranced by my sister that you don't even know when someone's talking to you?"
Monson looked at the girl incredulously.
"Don't be dramatic. I was thinking about something else." "I bet you were."
Giggling filled the air around the table. He glared at Indigo.
"Funny, real funny."
"I thought so."
"Did you need something, Indigo, or do you just like to annoy me?"
She cocked her head as she gazed at him, all while playing with a strand of her mousy-brown hair.
"Yes."
Her tone sounded playful.
"Yes?"
His tone reflected his weariness of this game.
"Yes, what?"
"Yes, I need something, and yes, I love to annoy you."
"I hate to interject, but weren't we talking about Damien?"
Artorius spoke up after Taurus's interruption. "Well, there's not much more to tell." The big guy was not doing well with Taurus being there. He was struggling to look directly at her. "But it really is amazing on both accounts." Taurus stared, her lush green eyes boring into him.
"I don't understand."
Her tone seemed tight, almost cold.
"What's so amazing?"
Everyone looked at her, including Artorius, who met her eyes for the first time since she sat down. Taurus seemed to notice that her words were not coming off exactly sweet. Monson could see it in her face. As if concluding that she needed to correct them, she spoke again, this time with a much kinder tone.
"What I'm saying is that I'm having a hard time understanding what is so amazing about another guy trying to beat Cyan."
She ran her hands through her hair.
"People trying to fight Cyan isn't out of the ordinary, even if it is Damien."
Artorius shook his head, as if to say that she was missing the obvious. "It's not that he was fighting Cyan. Everyone tries, and everyone fails. It's not that big of a deal if you ask me. I mean, I've never known a girl to have so much hype." He broke off, looking towards Indigo, his face clearly screaming that he had said too much, and was well aware of his mistake. Working through his sheepish look, he continued. Anyway, it's not that Damien tried to fight Cyan. It's how well he did." Taurus, Indigo, and all their respective friends looked baffled at this. Indigo voiced their collective concern.
"Why is that such a big deal? I mean, everyone knows that Damien is amazing at pretty much everything he does. Why would this be any different?"
"Fencing and other martial arts are vastly different than your average everyday sports. It isn't something you just pick up and become amazing at. You need talent, timing, balance, and most importantly, a master, a teacher. Sure, you can have all the talent in the world, but if you don't have anyone to guide you, it's all for nothing."
The girl's placid look of confusion remained. Monson picked up the conversation.
"Martial arts aren't just kicks and punches or swords and staffs. They constitute a way of life, a way of perceiving the world around you. Damien, or anyone else for that matter, can learn the strokes and practice them until his hands bleed. But unless a person is taught how to think like an artist, a warrior, training your mind with your body, they won't be able to reach that level that they're aiming for."
Monson's gaze shifted towards Cyan again.
"Cyan is a master, or really close to it. That wooden sword of hers echoes her heart's strength and conviction. To be able to match her level, even for the briefest of moments, says that in some way, Damien's heart and conviction are like Cyan's."
He stopped talking. Not that it mattered. He was not all that aware of what he was saying anyway. Artorius took over as Monson's words started to fade out. His voice sounded unsure, shocked, as if he was having a hard time understanding what was happening. Right. Well, in short, what Grey is trying to say is that Damien must have put in an enormous amount of work, researching a style and creating a game plan to counter Cyan's strengths. He had to have found a teacher to help him, as no one learns that fast without one. And finally, he must have put in countless hours of practice to be able to keep pace with her as long as he did. That's why it's so amazing. A permeating silence followed as the words found their mark. Taurus's eyes went wide. She looked ruffled, something that Monson, until now, considered impossible. Her friends whispered behind hands as a feeling of awe settled over the table. The feeling was distinct and collective, as if everyone there was sharing it. Collectively, all of them rolled the thought of Damien doing all that just for a date with Cyan around in their heads. Now that was persistence.
"Hey, Hero? I mean, Monson?"
The unfamiliar voice startled Monson. He turned, looking down the length of the table. Ignace Ikeka was peering at him intently, though her stare felt passive, glazed, almost numb. The rest of the group stared at her. He returned her look with one of his own, unsure of what to expect. She spoke again.
"Can I ask you a question?"
Her gaze did not falter, and again her tone felt hollow. He did not answer but put out a hand as if to prompt her to continue. She nodded, acknowledging his gesture.
"I was just wondering."
Her voice was quiet but with a hint of eagerness.
"How do you know so much about, well,"
she struggled to find the word,
"everything? Are you a martial artist? How about your knowledge of history? Nobody normal knows that much about history. My father and I, we were present when you won your scholarship. How did you win a competition that is well known to be rigged?"
Monson's jaw dropped. Talk about loaded questions. He did not even know where to begin. Inside him, he did not know where the words and explanations were coming from. He just knew. The words bubbled up like a programmed computer. But he could not say that, not to all these people. What did she mean, rigged? The Hornbeer competition was rigged? Then how did he win? How did he make it into this school? He did not know the answers to those questions any better than she did. What was he supposed to say? He remained silent for a long time. The table was quiet, way too quiet. It felt as if the noise from the rest of the students having dinner around them was hushed, just outside their circle, like an invisible sound barrier was impeding it.
"I can't answer your question, Ignace, even if I wanted to."
He stopped, trying to find the proper words. To his relief, an interruption saved him the effort. "Hello? What's with all the serious talk?"
Indigo butted into the conversation. Why would you want to know about boring old Monson anyway, especially when you could talk about someone like me? Laughter broke out among the girls. Monson joined in, even if he did not think it was that funny. Relief streamed through him. He looked toward Indigo. Their eyes met. He was starting to finally realize why Artorius found her so attractive. He was not out of the woods yet, however. Ignace seemed to be trying to say something. As she tried to speak over the noise, Monson noticed something. Casey. In all the excitement, he hardly registered the absence of Casey's distinct laughter. He turned to where Casey was sitting. Casey, however, was not paying any attention, but poring over a notebook, writing madly.
Casey, what are you doing?
Casey put up a single finger in his direction, not saying a word to him. Casey finished his scribbling with a flourish of his pen. Then, he finally looked up at Monson.
It's finished.
Casey closed the 3-ring yellow notebook, obviously relishing in the undivided attention. Monson looked at the notebook. Rather unremarkable, there was nothing on it that distinguished it from any other notebook a student might be carrying. He turned his head towards Artorius as he spoke.
Finished? Finished what?
Casey beamed around at the crowd of people at their table as they started to notice his and Monson's conversation. Yet Casey still did not offer any explanation. Artorius shook his head, a heavy look on his face.
His story.
Artorius looked up at Monson. He switched his attention to Casey.
You actually finished it?
Casey's smile grew more pronounced.
You bet. Grey was the inspiration I needed.
Hello? A voice cut across their conversation. The 3 boys turned their attention again to Indigo. She looked huffy and slightly red-faced.
Do you realize that you guys have now been ignoring some of the hottest girls in school for the better part of 5 minutes?
Casey gasped in a way that was almost certainly not genuine.
Pshaw, I'm so sorry. I'll make sure I pay better attention to Cyan from now on.
Indigo's face flushed more red. Monson jumped in before she could start anything.
What story, Casey?
Casey repositioned his body, turning towards Monson. Indigo continued to appear upset, though her friends looked like they were about to laugh.
This is my screenplay, bro.
Casey gave him a proud nod of his head.
Screenplay?
Monson peered more intently at the notebook in front of Casey.
I didn't know you were writing a screenplay. What's it about?
Splat! Monson winced as mud-like goo oozed down his face. He heard laughter and jeering. He dragged his hand across his face, clearing the viscous substance from his eyes. He smelled it.
Pudding?
He looked around at the shocked crowd.
Who threw that?
Said Artorius in a booming voice. The girls at the table recoiled as he stood up.
Not again,
thought Monson.
This is really starting to get old.
He glanced towards the middle of the cafeteria, looking for that one individual. He saw him, laughing with a group of his friends. Monson's eyes became slits as he felt his heartbeat a little faster. Derek.
That guy is really starting to get on my nerves.
Even through the pudding, Monson looked irritated. Casey stared at him.
Dude, why don't I just beat him down and be done with it?
Yeah, Case, that'd be wise.
Artorius cut in before Monson could say anything.
Why don't you go and beat the snot out of the dean's son? You'd get kicked out of here so fast, it'd make your head spin.
Casey shrugged.
Dude, it might be worth it.
Monson turned towards Taurus, but spoke to the girls as a whole.
Look, we better go, unless all of you want to get caught in the crossfire.
Muttering broke out among the various girls, though he could tell they were more anxious for him to leave than upset by the prospect of a food fight. He glanced at Taurus. She seemed unsettled, and even a little upset, but she nodded her head in acknowledgement as she met his gaze. Monson, Casey, and Artorius stood up and started towards the main doors of the cafeteria.
Dude, we better get out of here fast.
Casey quickly glanced over his shoulder towards the middle of the room.
I don't know when this thing's gonna escalate. Yeah, let's get a move on.
The pudding was starting to get sticky on Monson's face.
I want to wash this stuff off.
A commotion behind them drew their attention. They turned around and saw many students laughing, including Taurus and her friends. Pudding, and lots of it, covered Derek. He stood in the middle of his friends, wiping globs of the thick brown dessert from his head and chest. Oh, did he look livid. Monson thought he might seriously lose it. He and the others started to laugh.
Who threw that?
Derek looked wildly around the room. No one answered. The tables of students were either laughing or trying not to laugh as they looked away from Derek's gaze. Derek's eyes found Monson.
Oh, crap,
thought Monson.
Not good. He's gonna think it was me.
Surprisingly, Derek's gaze slid right past Monson to where Cyan was sitting. He scowled at her with an expression that was half puzzled, half enraged. She, however, did not seem to notice what was going on. She just continued to read her book. There was something different, however. Monson felt a hand take a hold of his shoulder. It was Artorius.
Grey, is Cyan blushing?
Monson peered at her, focusing intently on her cheeks. True enough, she was blushing.
You don't really think that Cyan was the one that threw that, do you?
The three of them were walking along the path leading back to the dormitories, now chatting loudly about the events that had just transpired. Artorius was in a state of shock, and was having a hard time believing that Cyan could have or would have thrown a bowl of pudding at Derek Dayton.
There's just no way she'd do that.
He looked wildly at Monson and Casey.
There's just no...
Casey interrupted him.
Okay, time out, Arthur.
Monson waited for the classic response. It did not come.
Wow,
Monson thought.
Artorius is really frazzled.
Casey continued his thought.
Why are you getting so worked up? I mean, even if Cyan did throw that pudding at Derek, which, by the way, totally hilarious, why would you care?
Artorius looked embarrassed for some reason.
It's just that
He paused.
You see, Indigo said that...
Monson put up a hand. Hold on, Arthur. There were too many people around. Dinner was just ending, and the students had completely infested the main pathway between the barracks and the GM, ready to make use of their free time. Monson wanted to know what Artorius was on about, but it had to be done in a setting that was a little more private. Way too many people were around. Predictably, the walk back from the GM to the barracks was agonizing. Artorius was obviously unsettled by whatever information Indigo confided in him. Despite their eagerness, Monson and Casey wanted to wait until they were at the barracks to discuss anything further. When they reached their destination, a commotion grabbed their attention as a shrill voice cut through the crowd's chatter like a blowtorch.
You'd better get out of my face.
A massive, bear-like boy stood in the middle of a group of smaller boys who were yelling at him.
Are those guys insane?
Casey shook his head.
Dude, you'd be surprised.
Grendel, the center in the offensive line of the Legionnaires, was a very big boy. However, off the field, he was mild-mannered, almost gentle. He did not react to the boys yelling at him, but stood still as they encircled him. Monson nodded towards the crowd of people. Casey and Artorius gestured their approval, and the three of them moved towards the fray.
What goes on between me and my girlfriend is none of your concern.
A tall, pasty boy with dull brown hair was up in Grendel's face. He had a sneer ground in his expression, but was still apprehensive, judging from the boy's movements. It was plain he did not want to upset the big center.
You don't have any right to interfere.
Grendel remained silent, examining the boy with a blank stare. He did not seem upset, but he did not appear happy either. He was just there. The rigid appearance was a bit unnerving. The boys that circled Grendel appeared to notice this behavior, as they also seemed apprehensive, undoubtedly caused by the giant's lack of speech. Now that they were closer and could see a bit better, Monson noticed that the ringleader of the band of students had a bruise on his left cheek. It looked swollen, puffy, and probably quite painful. Monson wondered how he had sustained such an injury. A small group of bustling girls, just beyond the screaming boys in Grendel's hulking frame, caught Monson's attention. The girls hovered around a single figure. She too seemed to be nursing a bruised cheek. Crying softly, the girl's tears flowed down her face as a red flush dulled the black and blue skin. It was plain to see that she was embarrassed, for whatever reason, by the current proceedings. One of the girls, who was tending to the crying girl, stood up and stepped in front of Grendel, facing the boy.
How dare you, Martin? We should report you. And don't think just because you're the governor's son that you'll get away with this. You should be expelled.
Martin sneered.
You dare talk to me, Emily? You're just a lowly scholarship student. You're here because of people like me and our generosity. And you presume to act with such audacity? You and your kind need to know your place.
Emily laughed, but her face burned red, reflecting a single ounce of truthfulness that occupied Martin's words. She was not done, however.
You and your money. You know, Martin, it's a good thing that you have money, because it's probably the only thing keeping you here. It sure isn't your grades. What'd you score in our last math test? Like a 5%?
People laughed at this announcement. Emily's face was still burning, but she stood her ground as she leered at Martin. His face flushed as people started to laugh. He raised his hand.
Why, you little...
Shock washed over the watching crowd as Martin's hand came crashing towards Emily's face. She closed her eyes and tried to shield her head. Monson, realizing what was about to happen, sprang towards the two, trying to stop Martin. Someone, however, beat him to it. She stood just to the left of Emily, ignoring the looks of astonishment. Monson let out a calm breath as a girl with curly blonde hair tied in a half ponytail held Martin's hand in a vice-like grip, cranking it back with surprising strength. Monson studied Kylie Cormac's face. She wore slightly shaded sunglasses, despite the dusty hue of impending evening. Her glasses, this time green and a little darker than the ones Casey took so many weeks ago, sat high on her face and exuded a cool and unconcerned air. Despite this, like the other times he had seen her, something about her posture seemed forced.
Martin? Emily? What seems to be the problem?
Kylie's voice flowed over the two. Martin eyed her with something close to wonder. She was touching him. Even if it was borderline violent, she was touching his arm, and he was painfully aware of it.
Well, you see,
He was having trouble answering her. The effect of her presence obviously was robbing him of his ability to speak. She gave him a formulated smile.
Martin, you need not worry yourself with such. I understand exactly what is going on.
An intoxicating voice penetrated Monson's consciousness. Chords of sound with their musical inflections found his emotional and spiritual centers. They stroked them, softly coaxing them into submission. What kind of submission? He did not care. Whatever it was or would become, it was bliss.
Grey, snap out of it.
Casey smacked Monson upside his head. Monson's mind rushed back to reality. His mind still felt a little hazy. He glanced around at the crowd, taking in the slack jaws and glassy eyes. Martin? Kylie's voice sounded for a second time. Again, Monson felt the subdued sound of rhythmic chords. For a second time, he found his thoughts starting to cloud. Casey whispered to him,
Focus, Grey. You're stronger than this.
Kylie continued speaking to Martin in a low, docile whisper. Despite the softness of her voice, everyone present heard her. Martin gazed at her with glassy-eyed attention. Martin? His body seemed to slack as she spoke his name a second time. He slowly brought the hand she was holding back to his side. She let go of it and spoke for a third time. Martin. He turned the rest of his body away from Emily, who seemed oblivious to the current happenings. Kylie spoke again.
You and Elizabeth are no longer together. You will not talk to her again, and you will never strike her or any other girl. Ever. Do you understand me?
Martin nodded his head.
Answer me, Martin.
His voice sounded slurred, but he spoke with conviction. Yes.
Then you may go.
She turned to everyone watching.
You all may go.
She clapped her hands together.
I don't want to ever see you again, Elizabeth.
Martin's words were forceful, absent of the previous, dreamy quality he spoke to Kylie with. Elizabeth did not look up as tears started rolling down her cheeks. He turned on his heel and walked away. Elizabeth looked up as he left. Kylie bent down and started talking to her. Elizabeth seemed unaware of her presence. With nothing left to watch, the spectators, including the massive Grendel, moved away slowly. Grendel seemed reluctant. He stared down with concern at the crying girl. Monson, Casey, and Artorius moved with the crowd. When they were out of earshot, Monson barraged Casey with questions.
Okay, what was that?
He gestured wildly with his hand, stepping in front of Casey as he did so. He was not sure whether to be impressed or disturbed. Nevertheless, the excitement of the situation was getting to him. He had to know. Artorius spoke, sounding confused.
Grey, what are you all excited about? I know you're from out in the country, but stuff like that is common, you know?
It was Monson's turn to be baffled.
Arthur?
Artorius shot a quick glance in his direction.
Sorry, Artorius, do you really not know what I'm talking about?
Of course I do. Kylie just broke up that Jerry Springer scene back there, and I'm just telling you, it's not all that uncommon. Couples fight publicly all the time. You should get used to it.
Monson looked from Artorius to Casey, neither of them saying anything. No, there was something going on here.
Casey?
Monson repeated the name with a certain degree of pleading. Casey shook his head. Casey did know something, but either he could not or would not give it up.
Fine.
Monson came to a decision.
I'll go and talk to her myself.
He turned around and started to walk back towards the front side of the building. Casey ran after him. Wait, hold up, Grey. Casey grabbed his arm to stop him.
Dude, you can't do that.
Monson yanked his arm out of Casey's grip.
Why can't I? If you're not going to tell me what's going on, I might as well get it from the source.
Casey did not seem to have an answer for that one. Monson turned and again was off. Casey and Artorius caught up to him in a hurry.
Seriously, Grey?
He tried to jump in front of Monson's path, but could not. as Monson moved just a little too quickly for him. Surprised at Monson's sudden agility, Casey shuffled to his side as he moved along.
Dude, can't you just drop it? Why do you want to know so badly anyway?
Monson answered, not breaking his stride.
Why wouldn't I want to know? Kylie basically just brain scrambled half the student body, and you play it off like it's nothing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not one to judge, but I at least have to ask. It'll drive me nuts if I don't. Grey, come on,
Monson anticipated his objection.
Listen, Case, I understand that you have some things you aren't ready to talk about. I know that. Artorius, he has things too. I'm just as guilty. There are things that I haven't even considered bringing up, let alone actually discussing them. I have loads that I should have told you, things that you need to know, but I'm not ready. I assume it's something similar with you. Putting all that aside, what just happened is flat out weird, surreal, amazingly magical, and every other crazy adjective that I can't think of right now. I already have enough mysterious and unexplainable things keeping me up at night. I don't need anything else. I'm going to talk to Kylie. You don't have to come. That's not it, bro. It's not something I'm hiding from you. It's something I don't want to get into with her. What do you mean? Why don't you want to get into it with her?
A noise interrupted their conversation. Casey, Artorius, and Monson stopped. They all listened as a voice, no, not a voice, more like a whisper, interrupted them.
Yeah, that was a bad idea.
The whisper sounded weak and breathy, as if the person had just run a marathon. The boys ducked reflexively behind one of the bush walls surrounding the barracks.
Hey, why are we hiding? I don't know.
Casey shrugged.
I was just following you, bro.
Monson stood up slightly and leaned over the edge of the bush wall. On a grassy spot on the other side of the wall, he saw a curly blonde girl with a disheveled half ponytail. Casey's childhood friend sat in a heap on the ground, breathing heavily, the contents of her book bag strewn across the grassy knoll. An indiscernible expression played across a tight-lipped scowl, as if she was in pain but did not quite understand how to deal with it. She rolled, landing on her back, and reached for her bag. Artorius's voice sounded from behind Monson.
Who is it, Grey? It's Kylie, and she looks like she's about to pass out.
He moved away from the corner wall.
Check it out.
Casey and Artorius moved into the vacated spot, peering around the corner.
What's wrong with her?
Monson did not know the answer to this question, but he had an inkling that Casey might.
Well, Casey?
Casey looked at Monson.
What's wrong with her?
Casey took a deep breath, concern starting to dominate his features.
I'm not really sure.
A retching sound cut them off. All three looked around the corner. Kylie was on her hands and knees, now convulsing like she was going to be sick.
This is ridiculous. I'm gonna go help her. Wait, Grey, we don't know what she'll do.
Monson, already half the distance between the trio and Kylie, simply waved over his shoulder. He slowed his pace as he neared her, trying not to startle her. Her head bobbled dangerously, as if barely connected to her neck. She looked up from the ground as he approached.
Are you okay, Kylie?
She shook her head as she looked at him. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused. He grabbed her arm and helped her up, astonished by how light she was.
Who's there? Monson Grey.
He tried to help her to her feet, but her legs buckled. Suddenly, Artorius was at his side.
Here, I gotcha.
The big guy picked her up, cradling her in his arms like a baby.
Arthur?
Her voice, while weak, sounded amused, like she was suddenly privy to some inside joke.
Then that means...
Her eyes suddenly flashed with a wild expression, something close to fear and desperation. She searched frantically for something, wiggling uncontrollably in Artorius's arms.
No, where is it? Arthur, help me. He can't see it. Please, help me find it.
Kylie, calm down. It's okay. I've got you. Everything's gonna be all right.
No, Arthur. You don't understand. Please don't let him find it. He can't. Please, Arthur, please help me find it.
Did you mean this? Casey's voice silenced all other sounds, as if a large blanket dropped over them. Kylie went still in Artorius's arms upon hearing the voice. Deathly still. She looked towards the direction of Casey's voice, eyes still glazed and unfocused.
No, Cassius, don't,
she pleaded in a whisper. Casey opened the small black leather planner he held in his hands. From the storm clouds brewing on his face, it was obvious. He did not like what he saw.
You've been listening to the podcast-only novel The House of Grey by Collin Earl. For more news, information, and updates, please visit houseofgreybook.com. Music by Figure of Fiends. Visit the band at myspace.com/Figure of Fiends. Cover art for The House of Grey provided by James Thane. More information at THAYN.net.